3:40 a.m., January 2, 1943. Mount Austen, Guadalcanal. Corporal Elias Bergstrom lay motionless in wet kunai grass, 200 yards inside Japanese-held ground, close enough to smell the sour reek of unwashed wool and rotting ration tins from the enemy position ahead of him. In his right hand, a 7-inch trapping knife his father had given him at 14, the edge freshly stoned, the steel blackened with soot and cooking grease so it would not catch moonlight. In his left, nothing, no rifle, no grenade. No radio to call for help if this went wrong. Somewhere in the tree line above him, a Japanese artillery spotter sat in a woven perch, field glasses trained on the American lines below, a radio handset ready to correct the next barrage on 2 men Bergstrom had eaten breakfast with 12 hours earlier. This was the 6th such position he had found in 11 nights. The first 5 were already silent, and no one at battalion had any idea he was the reason why. If he was caught tonight inside enemy lines, off the map, acting without written orders, armed with an unauthorized personal weapon, there would be no rescue, no covering fire, and very likely no explanation that would save him from a court-martial back at his own headquarters, assuming he lived long enough to face one. He had 11 minutes of darkness left before false dawn. 1 spotter, 1 knife. 6 men from his own company were dead, because artillery kept finding them in places no artillery should have been able to find. Bergstrom intended, before the sun rose over the Lunga Valley, to make sure it stopped finding them at all. What happened on that ridge in the first days of January 1943 would never appear in a citation. It would not earn Bergstrom a medal, a promotion, or so much as a footnote in the official history of the Guadalcanal campaign. It nearly earned him a general court-martial. But in the space of 11 nights, one enlisted man with a family hunting knife did something the finest counter-battery officers in the American Division could not do with all their maps, sound-ranging equipment, and observation planes combined. And by the time his superiors figured out what he had done, it was already working too well to stop. Elias Bergstrom grew up 200 yards from the shore of Shagawa Lake, outside Ely, Minnesota, in a clapboard house his father had built himself between trapping seasons. Ely sat at the literal end of the road, the last town before the Boundary Waters Wilderness swallowed the map, and from November through March, Gustav Bergstrom ran a trapline that stretched 9 miles through second-growth spruce and tamarack, checking sets for mink, marten, and fisher in temperatures that could fall to 40 below. Elias started walking the line with his father at age 9. By 14, he ran half of it alone. He learned to move through brush without snapping a branch, to read which way wind carried scent, to skin an animal with 3 unhurried cuts so the pelt came away whole. His father's trapping knife, a 7-inch blade with a worn hickory handle, hand-forged by a blacksmith in Tower, Minnesota in 1919, hung from his belt more often than not, sharpened every Sunday night on a natural whetstone kept wrapped in oilcloth. It was not a weapon. It was a tool for quiet, careful work, and Elias Bergstrom understood quiet, careful work better than almost anything else in his life. He enlisted in March 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, and by December found himself with the 132nd Infantry Regiment, 23rd American Division, climbing the muddy spine of Mount Austen on Guadalcanal, 6 miles southwest of Henderson Field, the last high ground the Japanese still held on the island. Below the ridgeline sat a fortified pocket of bunkers and spider holes the Americans had nicknamed the Gifu, after a prefecture in Japan many of its defenders called home. Japanese artillery dug into the high ground had been harassing Henderson Field and the men encircling the strongpoint for weeks, and it was shockingly, unnervingly accurate. The pattern first became impossible to ignore in the last week of December. Private Anton Novick, 20 years old, from a dairy farm outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin, was killed instantly when a Japanese mortar round landed inside a foxhole he had dug and camouflaged only 90 minutes earlier, a position no one outside his own squad knew existed. 2 nights later, Corporal Salvatore Esposito died carrying water up a supply trail that shifted its route nightly specifically to avoid observation. The round that killed him landed within 15 feet of where he stood, on a trail with no fixed markers. On New Year's Eve, Private Dmitry Petrov and Private Wade Calhoun were both wounded. Calhoun would die of those wounds 3 days later, when Japanese fire walked directly onto a machine gun position that had been relocated under cover of darkness less than an hour before the barrage struck it. Bergstrom had known all 4 men. He had shared a ration tin with Petrov 2 nights before Petrov went down. He carried Calhoun's pack the last half-mile up the ridge on New Year's Day, when Calhoun could no longer manage the weight himself. Battalion casualty reports counted them as artillery losses, a category as old as war itself. Bergstrom counted them differently. He counted them as men killed by another man's eyes. Standard American counter-battery doctrine depended on sound-ranging equipment, flash spotting, and aerial reconnaissance, tools built to answer the question of where enemy guns were firing from. None of it answered the harder question haunting the ridge: how the Japanese knew, within minutes and sometimes within a single relocation, exactly where to send the next round. Sound ranging could locate a gun. It could not explain how that gun's crew always seemed to already know the target had moved. The Army's own knife issue reflected how little anyone had prepared for this kind of war. The Marine Corps had only just approved its new Mark II fighting utility knife in November 1942, and the first deliveries were going to elite units, not to soldiers slogging up a muddy ridge with the Americal Division. Most infantrymen in Bergstrom's company still carried the standard-issue bayonet, or whatever personal blade they had brought from home, and few of either had been built for the kind of close, silent work a man might need if he ever found himself within arm's reach of an enemy soldier in the dark. Bergstrom's father's trapping knife, 7 inches of hand-forged steel from a blacksmith in Tower, Minnesota, had never been intended for combat at all. That, in the end, was part of what made it work. The answer came to Bergstrom not through a friend's death, but through a wounded man's silence. On January 1, 1943, Bergstrom was assigned to help carry casualties down from a forward aid station that had taken 2 direct hits in 6 hours despite being relocated once already. A medical corpsman treating the wounded, working under a poncho stretched between 2 trees to hide his lantern light, told Bergstrom something that stuck. The second barrage hadn't just landed near the aid station. It had landed on the exact spot where the wounded had been repositioned 20 minutes earlier, after the first hit, a movement visible only to someone watching from close, elevated ground, with a direct line down into the ravine. Bergstrom had spent a decade reading how animals moved through timber by watching where the woods went quiet. He understood, instinctively, what artillery officers with their slide rules and sound-ranging charts kept missing. This was not indirect fire finding targets by chance or by sound. This was fire being corrected in real time by a man with eyes on the ground, close enough to see individual soldiers, patient enough to stay hidden through daylight, and disciplined enough to wait for the highest value moment to radio a correction. He raised the idea with his platoon leader, First Lieutenant Foster Whitlock, a National Guard officer with a law degree from Wisconsin who took doctrine seriously and improvisation personally. Whitlock listened, then dismissed it. Patrols already swept the forward slopes daily, he said, and found nothing. Bergstrom's theory required an enemy observer skilled enough to remain undetected through repeated daylight patrols in thick jungle. An enemy capability American intelligence had no confirmed record of on this section of the line. "You're describing ghosts, Corporal," Whitlock told him. "I need targets, not folklore." Bergstrom did not argue further. Arguing with an officer who had already made up his mind was, in his experience, no different from arguing with a bank about the weather. But he kept thinking about the corpsman's story, about tree lines, about the specific, patient stillness required to watch a target for 20 unmoving minutes without so much as a shifted foot. He thought about the woven observation blinds Ojibwe guides sometimes built along the shoreline back home, platforms high and hidden enough that a man could watch a beaver lodge for hours without the beavers ever knowing he was there. That night, January 1, roughly 9:00 p.m., Bergstrom decided he was going to look for the ghosts himself, whether or not the army believed they existed. He told no one his full intention. He told his foxhole partner, Private Nicholas DeLuca, only that he was going to check something before first light. DeLuca, half asleep and used to Bergstrom's habit of disappearing on solitary reconnaissance, didn't press. Bergstrom checked the edge of his father's knife by feel in the dark, wrapped the handle in a strip of torn undershirt to kill the shine of worn hickory, and rubbed a mixture of mud and cold coffee grounds along the blade until it went dead matte under starlight. He did not carry his rifle. A rifle meant noise, and noise meant a dead man walking. What Bergstrom did over the next 2 hours, alone in a slit trench 60 yards behind the company line, was not sanctioned by any field manual he had ever been issued. He worked by feel and memory, the same way he had prepared a trapline knife every autumn since he was a boy. Only now the animal on the other end of his work wore an Imperial Japanese Army uniform and carried a radio instead of running on 4 legs. First, the edge. He drew the blade across a pocket whetstone in long, even strokes, 40 per side, checking the bite against his thumbnail the way his father had taught him, until the steel would shave hair without pressure. Second, the blackening. Bright steel through moonlight even under jungle canopy. Bergstrom had learned that lesson trapping under a hunter's moon on the Minnesota line, when a badly cleaned blade had spooked a marten from 30 yards. He mixed mud, cold coffee, and a smear of gun-cleaning oil into a paste, and worked it into the blade until the metal went the color of wet bark. Third, the grip. He unwound and rewrapped the hickory handle in strips of cloth soaked in the same mud paste, both to kill any residual shine and to give his hand purchase if it was slick with rain, sweat, or worse. The plan itself he built the way he'd once planned a long trapline circuit. Identify likely terrain, move before light, confirm sign before committing, and never approach from the direction an animal, or a man, would expect to be watched. Japanese observers, he reasoned, would choose high camouflaged perches with a clear sightline down into American positions, and an equally clear route back to their own lines if discovered from the front or below. That meant Bergstrom needed to come from above and behind. Through ground the Japanese considered their own rear area, not their forward observation screen. He understood exactly what he was risking: unauthorized penetration of enemy lines without orders, operating outside the sector his squad was assigned to hold, carrying and using a personal weapon that had never been issued, inspected, or approved by any ordnance officer in the United States Army. If he killed an enemy soldier and was later discovered to have done so without authorization, in enemy territory, at night, alone, the offense sat uncomfortably close to language used in general courts-martial for unauthorized combat action language that existed precisely to prevent soldiers from freelancing their way into diplomatic or tactical disasters. Lieutenant Whitlock had made his skepticism clear that afternoon. If this went wrong, there would be no cover story, no patrol report to fall back on, no one to corroborate that Bergstrom had acted for any reason beyond his own judgment. He thought about that for a long moment, crouched in the slit trench with the blackened knife across his knees, listening to a mortar barrage arc somewhere to the west, and wondering whose position it had found this time. Then he thought about Petrov's ration tin, still sitting unwashed in his own pack because he hadn't been able to make himself throw it away. He thought about carrying Calhoun's weight up the ridge on New Year's Day, Calhoun's breath already going shallow and wet. At 1:15 a.m. on January 2, Elias Bergstrom climbed out of the trench, checked the knife one last time against his palm, and started up the slope alone. He found nothing useful the first 3 nights out: long, silent crawls through wet grass and root tangle that yielded nothing but leech bites, a twisted ankle he did not report, and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that Lieutenant Whitlock might simply be right. On the 4th night, working 200 yards north of his previous searches, he found what he had been looking for: a woven platform lashed into the crotch of a banyan tree roughly 15 feet above the ground, screened by cut fronds that had been carefully replaced every few days to stay green, with a direct, unobstructed sightline down into the ravine where the aid station had twice been hit. He watched the position for the better part of an hour before he moved. He confirmed a single occupant, a radio handset, and a routine. The observer descended briefly before dawn to relieve himself and stretch cramped legs, using a knotted vine as a hand line, always at roughly the same interval after the last radio transmission of the night. Bergstrom waited in cover until the man was on the ground off balance, both hands occupied with the vine, and closed the last 8 feet in 3 unhurried steps, the same care he had once used closing on a marten caught only lightly in a foothold set, where one wrong sound meant the difference between a clean take and a wasted afternoon. It was over in under 4 seconds. No shot, no shout, no sound louder than a controlled exhale and the soft collapse of a body into wet ground cover. Bergstrom took the radio handset, the notebook of coordinates tucked inside the observer's tunic and nothing else, and was back inside his own lines 40 minutes before dawn, his father's knife cleaned on a handful of grass and resheathed against his hip. He told no one. Not DeLuca, not Whitlock, not the chaplain who noticed he looked pale at breakfast and asked if he was sleeping. For 5 more nights, Bergstrom returned to the same stretch of high ground, applying the pattern he'd confirmed on the first kill. Locate the platform by its unnaturally consistent foliage, confirm the routine, wait for the moment of maximum vulnerability, close the distance in silence, finish it with the knife rather than risk a shot that would bring an entire company down on him in ground he could not defend alone. 5 more positions. 5 more radios and notebooks carried back through the wire before first light. By the morning of January 7, 6 Japanese artillery spotters covering the American approach to the Gifu strongpoint had gone silent, one by one, and no officer on either side yet understood why. The 6th position, the one Bergstrom approached at 3:40 a.m. on January 2, chronologically his first confirmed kill of the sequence, though the one that would prove the method beyond any argument, sat higher and better defended than the others. A perch built into a tangle of strangler fig roughly 30 feet up, with a second Japanese soldier posted at the base as a runner, ready to relay coordinates by voice if the radio failed or drew counter-battery fire onto the position itself. Bergstrom had not planned for 2 men. He lay flat in the kunai grass for nearly 20 minutes, recalculating, the way he'd once had to recalculate an entire trapline circuit after finding a beaver dam had flooded half his usual sets overnight. 2 targets meant 2 openings, and only 1 knife. The runner moved first, walking a short patrol loop around the base of the tree every few minutes, boots crushing the same patch of undergrowth each pass, disciplined and utterly predictable. Bergstrom timed the loop 3 times against his own pulse before he moved. On the runner's 4th circuit, Bergstrom came out of the grass low and fast, catching him from behind at the exact moment his weight shifted onto his forward foot. The same instant of balance loss Bergstrom had learned to read in a deer stepping over deadfall, the half-second where a body cannot easily reverse direction. One hand clamped over the mouth, the blade driven up and in below the ribs, angled the way his father had shown him for a killing shot on a wounded animal that could not be allowed to cry out. The runner went down without a sound beyond a single expelled breath. The jungle held its usual night sounds around him, the tick of insects, the far-off cough of a mortar section registering somewhere behind the Gifu line, the wet drip of the last hour's rain still working its way down through the canopy. And Bergstrom let all of it wash past without reacting, The way his father had taught him to let the ordinary noise of the woods pass through him unremarked, so his ears stayed tuned for the one sound that mattered. Above him, the spotter in the tree had heard nothing. Bergstrom froze against the trunk for 90 full seconds, listening for any change in the rhythm of the radio traffic filtering down from the platform. A murmured position report, unhurried, unaware. Then he began to climb, using the same knotted hand line the spotter himself had rigged, moving only when the man above shifted his weight or spoke into the handset, freezing instantly when the platform went still. It took nearly 6 minutes to close 15 feet of vertical distance without a single creak of green wood or scrape of fabric against bark. 6 minutes that felt, Bergstrom would say decades later in the only interview he ever gave about that night, longer than anything else he did in the entire war. He came over the edge of the platform in one motion, a hand across the observer's mouth before the man could draw breath to shout, the blade already moving. It ended the way the others had, fast, close, and almost entirely silent, 4 seconds from first contact to stillness, the observer's radio handset still warm in his hand when Bergstrom eased it free. Below, on the ridge, a mortar section that had fired 7 corrected barrages in the previous 2 days did not fire an 8th. It would not fire another accurately aimed round at American positions on that stretch of ridge for the remainder of the campaign. Bergstrom carried the notebook, the handset, and, for the first time, a Japanese army compass taken from the runner's body, and moved back down through the grass toward his own lines with 11 minutes of darkness still on the clock, exactly as he'd calculated before he'd ever left the trench. He crossed back through the wire at 4:52 a.m., cleaned the blade in the dark, and was in his foxhole, eyes closed, 20 minutes before the company began to stir for the day. The change in the shelling was noticed within 48 hours, though at first no one connected it to Bergstrom. Battalion S2 officers, reviewing the pattern of incoming fire against the Gifu strongpoint for the first week of January, found something that did not fit any counter-battery theory on record. Japanese artillery and mortar fire aimed at American positions on the northern approach had gone from unnervingly precise to almost blind, landing on old coordinates, empty ground, and positions abandoned days earlier. One intelligence summary from January 8 described the shift bluntly as a sudden and unexplained collapse in enemy fire accuracy across the sector. Private DeLuca noticed something closer to home first. He had watched Bergstrom slip out of their shared foxhole alone on 6 separate nights in 8 days, always before 2:00 a.m., always back before the company began to stir, always carrying nothing when he left, and DeLuca began to realize, once he started paying closer attention, always carrying something small and folded when he returned. On the morning of January 8, DeLuca finally asked him directly what he'd been doing. Bergstrom, exhausted past the point of caring much about consequences, told him the truth in 4 flat sentences. DeLuca did not report it. He simply stopped asking questions and started noticing, with something close to awe, how quiet the ridge had become at night. Word moved the way word always moves in a rifle company. Quietly, sideways, through men who trusted each other more than they trusted the chain of command. By January 10, most of Bergstrom's own squad knew, in outline if not in detail, that the corporal from Minnesota had been doing something at night that explained why the shelling had stopped finding them. None of them told an officer. It was Lieutenant Whitlock himself who eventually put the pieces together, after a captured Japanese notebook recovered from a forward position. One of the 6 Bergstrom had carried back through the wire and quietly turned over to the company clerk without explanation, logged simply as "found item," was translated by a battalion interpreter, and revealed detailed American troop movements, foxhole relocations, and fire correction notes that could only have come from close, sustained observation. Whitlock summoned Bergstrom on the afternoon of January 11. The conversation was short and, by Bergstrom's later account, almost entirely one-sided. "Corporal," Whitlock said, holding the translated notebook, "I want to know exactly where this came from, and I want to know exactly what you have been doing on this ridge for the past 11 nights. Bergstrom, standing at something close to attention in a foxhole that smelled of mud and cordite, told him, "All of it. The knife. The 6 nights. The 6 men." Whitlock did not raise his voice. He simply closed the notebook, told Bergstrom to consider himself confined to the company area pending review, and walked away. The formal inquiry that followed over the next several days was never labeled a court-martial in the surviving battalion correspondence, but it carried every hallmark of one in its early stages. Bergstrom was questioned 3 separate times, once by Whitlock, once by the battalion executive officer, and once, briefly and with evident discomfort, by a major from Division Intelligence who seemed less interested in punishing Bergstrom than in extracting every detail of his method for the division's own use. The core of the Army's discomfort was never really about the killing. Soldiers killed the enemy every day on that ridge, with rifles, grenades, mortars, and bayonets, and no one convened an inquiry over it. What unsettled Bergstrom's superiors was the unauthorized nature of the action. A soldier operating alone, outside his assigned sector, beyond any officer's knowledge or control, carrying a weapon that had never passed through Army ordnance inspection, making unilateral decisions about when and how to engage an enemy his own chain of command had explicitly told him did not exist. It was, in the driest language of military law, conduct that placed personal judgment above lawful orders, precisely the kind of freelancing an army built on command discipline could not simply wave through, however effective it had proven. Against that stood the evidence, and the evidence was not subtle. Division Intelligence confirmed that 6 Japanese observation positions along the northern approach to the Gifu had gone silent in the exact window Bergstrom described. Artillery accuracy against American positions in that sector had fallen by more than half in the same period, corroborated independently by the S2 fire pattern analysis compiled before anyone knew Bergstrom's name. 6 captured notebooks and radio handsets, already logged and forwarded to division, matched his account in sequence and location. A young corporal from a farm town on the Canadian border had accomplished, alone, with a hunting knife and 11 nights of patient, methodical work, what an entire counter-battery apparatus of sound-ranging equipment and aerial reconnaissance had failed to achieve in a month. The officers convened to review the matter. Whitlock, the battalion executive officer, and the division intelligence major argued for the better part of an afternoon over what to do with him. Punishing Bergstrom for insubordination and unauthorized combat action was, on paper, entirely defensible. It was also, everyone in the room understood, likely to look absurd if it ever became public that the Army had disciplined a man for single-handedly blinding an enemy artillery network that had been killing Americans daily. Commending him openly, on the other hand, meant formally endorsing a method, solo infiltration and knife killing, undertaken without orders, by an enlisted man acting on his own initiative, that no field manual sanctioned and no officer wanted junior soldiers to believe was standard practice. The resolution, reached on January 14, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely and left Bergstrom with almost nothing to show for it. There would be no charges. There would also be no medal, no citation, and no public acknowledgement of what he had done. Bergstrom was quietly reassigned, at the intelligence major's specific request, to help train a small group of scouts from other companies in observation post identification and night movement. His knowledge absorbed into the division's institutional practice without his name ever attached to it. Whitlock, in the only gesture of respect Bergstrom would later say he genuinely valued, shook his hand privately before the reassignment and told him, "You were right about the ghosts, Corporal. I should have listened the first time." What Bergstrom taught in the scout sessions that followed spread through the American Division's units around Mount Austen faster than any training circular could have. By the third week of January, other soldiers and men who had never trapped a day in their lives but had grown up hunting deer in the Ozarks or Appalachians, or simply had the patience for slow, careful work, began adapting pieces of his method. Blackened blades, methodical route finding into observed but unconfirmed enemy positions, timed approaches built around an enemy's own predictable routine. None operated with the same discipline or produced the same results Bergstrom had, but the underlying principle, that Japanese observation posts could be found, watched, and eliminated by infantrymen willing to move slowly and think like the enemy they were hunting, took hold across the sector. The statistical shift was documented, if quietly. Division after-action summaries covering the 2 weeks before Bergstrom's nights on the ridge recorded 11 American casualties directly attributable to what the reports termed unusually accurate, indirect fire against the northern Gifu approach. In the 2 weeks following, that number fell to 1, and that single casualty came from a barrage fired at a fixed map coordinate rather than any observed, corrected target. Japanese radio traffic intercepted by division cryptanalysts in mid-January noted, in fragments later translated, growing frustration among artillery units at the Gifu over lost forward observers and degraded fire control confirmation from the enemy's own communications. That the collapse Bergstrom had engineered was neither accidental nor temporary. Even the enemy's response validated what Bergstrom had done. Surviving Japanese accounts from the Guadalcanal campaign describe artillery and infantry units alike operating on reduced rations, dwindling ammunition, and increasingly fragile lines of communication by January 1943. A force already stretched past what its command structure could reliably coordinate. Losing 6 trained observers in the space of 11 nights, without a single shot fired or a single body found in daylight, was the kind of loss that force could not easily explain or replace, and Japanese officers at the Gifu, according to intercepted fragments, spent as much effort in mid-January trying to determine how their forward observers kept vanishing as they did trying to hold the position itself. Credit for the shift, when it appeared at all in official channels, went to improved counter-reconnaissance measures and enhanced infantry security procedures, a bureaucratic language that erased Bergstrom's name as thoroughly as the Army's silence had erased his knife. The Gifu strongpoint itself fell in the 3rd week of January 1943, its garrison destroyed under Major Takeyoshi Inagaki in a final assault after American forces completed its encirclement. An assault made measurably safer, though the official record would never quite say so, by an artillery network that could no longer see where to aim. Elias Bergstrom survived Guadalcanal and the rest of the war, serving through subsequent Pacific campaigns before returning to the United States in late 1945. He went home to Ely, Minnesota, and did the only thing he had ever really wanted to do. He picked up his father's trapline. He married in 1947, raised 3 children in the same clapboard house on Shagawa Lake, and spent the next 4 decades running trap sets through the same second-growth timber he had learned on as a boy, later working part-time as a hunting and canoe guide for visitors to the Boundary Waters. He almost never spoke about the war. His children remembered a father who would go quiet and change the subject whenever a television program touched on the Pacific campaigns, who kept a single unmarked hunting knife in a drawer that none of them were permitted to touch, and who, every January too, without explanation, would spend the evening alone in his workshop, sharpening blades that did not need sharpening. He did not attend division reunions. He gave no interviews to local newspapers on Veterans Day, despite decades of quiet requests. He died in 1994 at age 71 of heart failure at the same house where he had grown up. His obituary in the Ely Echo ran 4 sentences, noting his Army service in the Pacific and his decades running a trapline, and said nothing at all about 6 nights on a ridge above Henderson Field. The full story surfaced only in 2011, when a military historian researching the Mount Austen campaign for a university oral history project tracked down Bergstrom's youngest son, who still lived in Ely, and asked about a fragment of the story he'd heard second-hand from an aging Whitlock family member. The son produced the unmarked knife from the workshop drawer, along with a handful of letters Bergstrom had written but never sent to Nicholas DeLuca after the war, describing, for the only time in writing, what those 11 nights had actually involved. Cross-referenced against division intelligence summaries, translated Japanese radio intercepts, and the surviving after-action reports from January 1943, The historian's research finally connected the sudden collapse of Japanese artillery accuracy at Mount Austen to a single Minnesota corporal acting almost entirely alone. A conservative estimate, built from the fire pattern data and casualty projections for the 2 weeks Bergstrom's method, remained active, placed the number of American lives saved by the silencing of those 6 observation posts at somewhere between 30 and 50 men. Soldiers who never knew a trapper's knife from Ely had bought them the days they needed to survive the ridge. There is no monument to Elias Bergstrom on Mount Austen, and no line in any official Army history bearing his name. What he proved, in 11 nights that no field manual anticipated and no medal ever recognized, is that the most decisive innovations of a war are rarely handed down from a headquarters tent. They come, more often than anyone in a chain of command likes to admit, from a soldier who noticed something the doctrine had missed, and who was willing to risk everything, court-martial, court of law, his own life, to fix it quietly, without waiting for permission that was never going to come in time to matter. If this story of a Minnesota trapper who blinded an enemy artillery network with nothing but patience and a family knife moved you, give this video a like and subscribe for more true stories of the ordinary soldiers whose battlefield ingenuity changed the course of World War II, the ones history nearly forgot to write down. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for helping keep these stories alive.